Are we living in a post-truth environment? Today, on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Linda Zerilli, a political science professor from the University of Chicago, joins me in examining truth, feminism, and women's rights during the Donald Trump presidency. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Linda Zerilli. We're going to talk about women and democracy. Dr. Zerilli, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
It's good to have you here. You are a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and I understand you received your Ph.D. from University of California at Berkeley, where you wrote about images of women in political theory, agents of culture and chaos. Can we talk about women as agents of culture and chaos for a second here to get started?
Sure.
Where did you go with that?
Right. Well, when I was studying at Berkeley, there really wasn't very much in feminist theory, actually, at the time, in political science.
Yeah.
And so we read, the great books. So Rousseau, Burke, Mill, these were three of the people that I worked on in my dissertation and later in my first book. And I became very interested in the figure of woman. In other words, how were women seen? Not just, what were the terrible things that men said about women. There was sort of this generation of feminist scholars who were really interested in the things that these philosophers and political theorists said about women, mostly all the terrible things that they said about them, or sort of false complimentary things.
So not what people were saying in bars and stuff, but what famous
exactly.
great philosophers were saying.
What
right?
did they actually say about women in their texts when they mentioned women at all?
Yeah.
And so that generation of sort of scholarship existed, but really what interested me was going beyond just what they said about women to the way in which they actually constituted political space in the absence of women, so that the absence of women in the political space became a condition of politics itself, if you know what I mean.
Right.
It wasn't just a matter of, well, they said this about women or that about women. It was that women really had no place within their understanding of what politics was. And that really fascinated me, and also the way in which women were cast then as what I call these sort of border figures or liminal figures in political theory, where they are either seen as agents of chaos, i.e. always undermining the public realm, mostly through their sexuality, or they were seen as agents of culture. So the angel in the house, and someone like John Stuart Mill, the notion of the virtuous woman, et cetera, who's going to uphold politics in the political realm by virtue of her chastity or whatever. So that's, that just fascinated me because it really became a more integral way of thinking about how the exclusion of women was not just a sort of historical, blip, that could be fixed, but that the way we think about politics actually in itself is already based on that radical exclusion.
That it's embedded in the intellectual discussion as well. So I'm just curious, how did they fare? How did Marx come across? Or, when you were looking at these philosophers and how they treated their views of women. Can you give me a couple examples? You mentioned Mill, John Stuart Mill.
Well, John Stuart Mill is actually a really interesting example because I think he was, for me, the most complicated figure in that John Stuart Mill, of course, wrote On the Subjection of Women, which is a very, very powerful feminist text. And he was one of the few men in his generation, Victorian England, who was really arguing the case for women's rights very strongly, for women's suffrage and the rest. But one thing that struck me was I could never understand why John Stuart Mill did not criticize the gender division of labor. In other words, he still thought that it was a woman's job to stay in the family and to take care of the children and be, and so on. And also he had a very deeply critical view of the employed and unemployed poor. So he was very worried about their sexuality, and sexuality was just a big theme for Mill. And so women were really, in Mill's work, seen as agents of culture in the sense that they were the ones who were, through their, domestic labor and proper sort of moral behavior, kind of to be this uplifting force. But that also required them to remain in the domestic realm, which Mill, of course, himself also criticized.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, so it was someone taking a step in the right direction, but rather unrealistically.
Well, I mean, I don't want to say unrealistically. I still think that Mill was an incredible radical. And when I go back and when I teach him today, I always say to my students, don't overlook what Mill achieved and the arguments that he made. You also need to read a text like On the Subjection of Women and a lot of these very early feminist texts as works of rhetoric. I mean, I know you're interested in rhetoric, and it's sort of how do you persuade an audience that really does not think that women should ever set foot in the public sphere? So Mill needed to, imagine his audience, imagine the kinds of arguments that they would have and counter them. So many times he made arguments that I think he himself didn't necessarily believe, but he was trying to address the people who he thought would be, the real opponents.
Yeah, he was a skilled rhetorician as well as a philosopher.
Yeah, as was Burke.
Yeah. Well, so we talk about feminism and women's rights. How do we separate those two? Are we referring to the same thing, or are those terms take us in different directions slightly?
Well, I think they do take us in different directions, but let me start by saying that I think feminism is, for me, more of an umbrella term, which encompasses struggles for women's rights, but goes beyond just the struggle for rights. That includes things like trying to rethink relations in the family right from the ground up, who's doing the dishes, who's doing the child care, all of that sort of thing, which isn't just a matter of women's rights as such, but actually these everyday relations that women have with their partners and in particular, with men. So women's rights is something that, you can trace women's rights back certainly to the 17th century. I think of figures who were really important in the women's rights movement are people like Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, also another figure who has been very much remembered and at the same time forgotten, seen to have said things that are just so obvious to us today. But when you go back and you read someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, you see how radical her conception of rights claims were. That is to say that
was a kind of a radical period in British history anyway.
Oh, very much so, yeah. I mean, the pamphlet wars, I had a graduate student of mine, Angela Mayone, who wrote a wonderful dissertation on Mary Wollstonecraft, which really reanimated her thought, I think, for us today. Because like a lot of these women authors, they have just been forgotten. There's a sense that, well, women's rights have been achieved. We have all the rights that we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment, by the way, and I could go on in that direction. But nevertheless, basically women have the same formal political rights as men. So the struggle for women's rights is formally over. But it's not over because rights are really only good if you can claim them, if you can enact them. So there's still a lot of room for feminism to struggle for women's rights.
Well, if we think of this as a historical trajectory here, how do you view the pitting of the first female candidate for president with a major party running against Donald Trump, who is sort of kind of looking down his nose at political correctness and things like that, and Trump winning this battle? Is this a blow to women's rights, or is this really something bigger that's going on, and it really wasn't about that? What do you think?
I do think it is a blow to women's rights. And, of course, there are a lot of people who will say that Hillary Clinton was not the ideal candidate. I have said that myself, et cetera. She was a Clinton. There were lots of problems.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think one cannot lose track of just the everyday sexism that was voiced and really allowed to be voiced during the campaign in the figure of Donald Trump, and then all the people who saw themselves as his supporters. So there was a lot of sexism that came to bear on Hillary Clinton and on her campaign, and a lot of things that she was expected to say, that a man perhaps would not have been expected to say, lots of demands that in general were made upon her, and criteria that were used or applied to her because she's a woman. And that's true of all women politicians, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it's important not to lose track of the everyday sexism that was at work in that campaign, even as we try to understand the mistakes of the Democratic Party in not speaking to a whole sector of the electorate, or at least not speaking a language that they heard.
Yeah. Well, let's explore that for a second. I mean, what are some of the examples of the sexism during the campaign? Because you also mentioned that it was allowed to be said. So you're saying that the media played a part, I'm assuming, in letting the dialogue go in that direction.
Right. Well, I just think that in general, Hillary Clinton was often portrayed as a very sort of harsh woman with no real sense of humor, and she had to really work at, this is what we were told, she had to really work at showing her more feminine side, and then there was the whole pantsuit debacle, and I mean all of these things that went on and on about how Hillary is not coming across as the person that you want in charge when the Russians have launched, the missiles, right? So, I mean, But she was always caught, like all women are, I think, in politics, between a rock and a hard place, because of course she has to act very tough, and she's going to be the commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
But at the same time, really be seen as someone who's warm and receptive and all of that. And I mean, Donald Trump never was the sort of cuddly kind of figure.
Yeah, he
never
was just
expected.
himself.
He was just himself, right, exactly. But there was no expectation for him to be warm and cuddly, right?
But what if she had? I mean, what if she hadn't tried to meet those expectations? I mean, do you think that those were just sort of latent expectations that that maybe could have been ignored? Maybe she would have been better if she ignored them. Because one of the things that I thought Trump had in common with Bernie Sanders is they were both just being themselves. They both seemed to be, sometimes Sanders would say things that were against his own best interest just because he thought they needed to be said. And so they both came across as being very genuine. Obviously Sanders was genuine in a deeper way than Trump was, because Trump was being, was just spontaneous and
right.
In an extreme sense. But Hillary, yes, was measured, and and you could tell that that her the way she was dressed and her her hairstyle, everything was done to create a rhetorical impression. What would have happened, just for conversation's sake? What do you think would have happened if she just ignored all that and just was herself?
Well, honestly, I just think that just being yourself really is a form of racial and gender privilege.
Yeah.
Okay, that is to say that a woman cannot just be herself, and neither can a black man. I mean, if you think about Obama, Obama had to work very hard at not coming across as the angry black man.
You're right.
So, this
he was
idea
very conscious of that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the demand, well, if she'd just been herself, well, what if she had just been herself? Maybe she would have gotten even fewer votes. Well, she actually got more votes than he did, but, she would have gotten fewer votes. So it's...
There are women in politics who do seem to be as open and spontaneous as Sanders and Trump.
I think that is increasingly
Warren, for instance,
the case.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that women are increasingly recognizing that you can't win either way, so you may as well choose one side or the other. Yeah. But my point is just this idea of authenticity, et cetera, really is a form of racial and gender privilege. And so I don't blame Hillary Clinton for that. I mean, I think she did sometimes come across as very stilted, there's no question about it. But that's also part of the challenge of running as a female candidate for President of the United States.
Well, so if someone were running, a woman were running today and she put you on her team to advise her, how would you tell her to deal with that?
I think it's...
In a second.
I wouldn't, in a second I wouldn't say just throw up your hands and just be yourself, but I would say probably come as close to, quote, being yourself as you can, because in the end, you're really not going to win if you play their game.
I think I got that same impression of it.
Yeah.
You've also write about the democratic process and the public sphere. To what extent do you think Trump is the creator of the political dynamic right now, and to what extent do you see him as sort of the result of the political dynamic that we're in right now? Have you thought about it like that?
Yeah, I think you definitely can think about it like that. Is he creating the political climate, or is he simply mirroring it? Clearly, I think it's both. It has to be both. No one individual can create that kind of political dynamic. People had lost faith in the democratic process, in elections, and for good reason. We have jerry-rigged elections. We have jerry-rigged districts. People have good reason to have lost faith, and have lost faith in the Democratic Party, quite frankly. But at the same time, Trump is someone who has his finger on the pulse of where, the fractures exactly are. And
much better than the Democrats did this last round. He seemed to be really tuned in.
Well, for sure. But let's also remember, the other day I opened up the New York Times, and as usual, there were, every article on the front page was about Trump. And I said to a friend of mine, it's sort of, Trump combed his hair, Trump brushed his teeth, Trump did this, whatever it is, whatever he did, that counts as news. So let's face it, there's a kind of reality show that is being constructed by the media, and oftentimes by the media that says that it is critical of Trump, like the New York Times, just by simply following on his every word. You think, when was the last time you saw an article in the New York Times on the war in Syria? It's like, is there still a war in Syria? Well, I don't know, but I know what Trump had for breakfast. So, that I actually find much more disturbing than all the insane things that he says from day to day. It's more about how the media follows on every word, because it's entertainment, let's face it.
Well, so, do you see the news media then as directing the discourse or responding to it? If Trump is president and he does these things, don't they have to report them?
No, I don't think that they have to report every single thing that he says. I really don't. And I think probably if you were to compare, I haven't done this comparison, but if you were to compare the kinds of stories and the way in which the focus on Trump, and this was true when he was a candidate for president as well. He was just simply the focus, even all the bad things he said, all the outrageous things. That was still news. And as I say, bad news is better than no news. So,
as a former journalist, I would have felt compelled to report most of those things. We've had not a lot of examples in our lifetimes of people that were that outrageous in what they were saying, but we did have the time when I think Reagan was testing a microphone, and he said, we're going to bomb Russia in the next 5 minutes or something, and somebody had recorded it and it got out, and that was being talked about for weeks afterwards, for years afterwards, really. But Trump says things like that daily, and it almost seems like they have to tell us that, otherwise we wouldn't know the nature of the person that we've put in charge of everything. But what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's just about, of course, they need to tell us the things that the President of the United States said. I agree with that. The problem is that many times the reporting remains at the level of the purely of pure, really of pure entertainment, in the
Right.
sense of he said that?
Yeah.
Are you kidding? You know, it's always this idea of, did he really top himself? Is that possible anymore? Rather than, okay, Trump said this, now let's do a massive fact check on what Trump said, or let's just go into this in terms of
Right.
what this means for public policy. That's what I expect when I read the New York Times, you know, not just telling me all the things that Trump or any other politician for that matter said.
Well, and of course, when we say the news media, we speak as if it was one entity. Of course, it's not. I mean, are there places where you go for, you know, the kind of news that you expect, for the quality of news that you expect?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not so much of a, I mean, a lot of my friends go to the internet and, you know,
Yeah.
search around there for different, I tend to just sort of stick with bona fide publications. So whether it's The Nation or whatever it may be, you know, women's publications, et cetera.
The magazine format seems to be doing a better job lately, right?
Well, yeah, and where I have some sense of who are the journalists, that there really is some fact checking taking place there.
Yeah, New York Review of Books, you know, places like that.
Right.
We mentioned, you know, truth telling here. You've also done some work
Right.
with Hannah Arendt and her views on truth, and how that our understanding of truth can be undermined, how that impacts democracy. Would you like to just address that for a minute? We're getting to the close here, but I thought that would be worth talking about a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, well, Arendt, it's interesting, she wrote this very well-known piece, at least among Arendt scholars, called Truth in Politics, in which she attacked the idea that truth has any place in the political realm, because in her view, truth is anti-political. And she associated truth really with the philosophical truth or absolute truth, truth that's not contestable, or logical truth. But what she was really interested in there is the question of factual truth, and how factual truths ultimately depend for their reality on our talking about them. They have to circulate among citizens as things that we discuss and we agree to disagree over, not over the facts themselves, but over their meaning. And so, you know, in her view, totalitarianism really arose essentially in the vacuum that's created when the very sense of any difference between truth and falsehood no longer exists, when it just doesn't matter anymore. Everything is just simply fake news, to use, you know, Trump's, once again, violating my own rule here, but, you know, Trump's motto. So I think that she really called our attention to the way in which things that have happened in the past, simple factual truths that you think, oh, well, who could deny that? That's just a simple fact. Well, actually, they really do depend on people talking about them and debating them. And
sort of embedding them in the culture.
Exactly, they have to be part of a public debate and part of the public realm.
So she was, of course, reflecting on what happened in Germany prior to World War II.
Right.
When she was writing that. How does that apply to us today?
Well, I think it applies to us today because there's such a massive erosion of the very concept of factual truth. I mean, you know, everyone is familiar with the images of Obama's inauguration and Donald Trump's inauguration, and you know, you can look at those pictures and you think, how is it possible that someone could look at Donald Trump's inauguration and actually think that there are as many people as there? So something's going on there, right? There is a kind of erosion of the ability to really assess what is fact. And
so is it an erosion of the ability to do that, or is it erosion of the way that it's being presented?
It's probably
you know,
both.
The standards of the journalist, maybe.
Right. I mean, some of my friends have said, look, you know, it's not that people don't see that there are less people there, but they just don't care. Because in their view, the people who are there are so enthusiastic that they make up for the missing bodies. I mean, I don't know whether that's true, but I do think that there is an erosion of, I mean, everyone says this, you know, that we live in a so-called post-truth, you know, political climate in which the appeal is not to facts, it is really to emotions. And I think that's right, but at the same time, what I worry about a little bit is, you can fall back into a form of argumentation where it's just a matter of, insisting on the idea of objective truth. Like, there are just facts and they are indisputable and everybody just has to agree on them. That's the, sort of George Orwell's stance on truth, right? And Arendt would say, well, that notion of objective truth is kind of the notion that has collapsed, and actually rightfully so, but cannot be repaired, because really what we have to understand is that truth is ultimately, factual truths rely on opinion, so they are entangled in each other.
Yeah. I suppose that relates to Aristotle's argument that the character of the speaker is more important than the argument, right? If this truth is repeated in conversation and people are agreeing with it, it sort of gives it sort of an ethical proof that's inherent in the overall discussion, right, rather than from the speaker. Yes, that is all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Linda Zerilli for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.